Rainwater sprinkled onto the glass of my blackened bedroom window, as it often did this time of year. Trick-or-treating in my town was rare because of the usual October drizzles. No one wanted to trudge the streets in a drenched white sheet and beg for Haribos in the rain. Myself, least of all. Horror had never really been my thing after all, but not because I'm easily scared. Quite the opposite, actually. Being stuck indoors most Halloweens, my mother and father would have us watch scary movies while chomping on chocolate as the sun fell past the rooftops. They cared little of the disturbing subject matter, often displayed in them when it came to me. However, in his youth, my father suffered from terrible night terrors, you see. He used to tell me of figures he would see, looming over the foot of his bed at night, of ghouls and demons who would creep into his nightmares to leave him panting upright in a cold sweat. My assumption was that he wanted to let me face these horrors head on, that he thought if he could show me that monsters and ghosts were all works of fiction, then I would somehow become desensitized to the frights. A somewhat questionable method, I know. But to his credit, after the early years, this method began to bear fruit. My parents would curl up on the sofa, shrieking at every jump scare and sudden loud noise, while I would slouch in my seat, unamused. I tell you this because as I grew older, they began to pick up on this. They would leave me to be independent and mostly self-governing when it came to my interests, and by the time my teenage years came, they often trusted me to be alone for sometimes days on end. Traditionally, the 31st of October was one such occasion. I rarely questioned what they would get up to on these monthly escapes, but they both seemed very happy when they would return, so I had my suspicions. I lay on my bed, listening to the tapping of water on glass. I checked my phone. 6 p.m. Strange, I thought. It never got dark this early, even this time of year. I shrugged it off. I reached for my earphones and plugged them in, selecting a song at random. As the music faintly buzzed in my ears, I fell in and out of sleep more times than I care to recount. This must have persisted for little more than an hour, as when I finally came to, I had that foul, dry taste in my mouth, and my unsaturated eyes stung thirstily. I plucked my earphones from my ears and sat up, rubbing my eyes as I did. It'd be worth grabbing a drink and a bite to eat, I thought once that funky pattern I saw subsided. With a groan, I pushed myself off my bed and onto the top of the stairs. Spotting the bowl of sweeties my parents must have left for me to give the rare trick-or-treaters who might come around. Resting beside the front door as I lazily clambered down the stairs. Once in the kitchen, I picked out a cup from the cupboard and, somewhat startlingly, only just began to be troubled by the eerie absence of noise in my home. You hear people describe places as too quiet, and I think I was starting to realize what they meant by that. Not a gust of wind, nor the pattering of rain could be heard outside the blackened windows now. Confused, I peered out the window above the sink as I began to fill my cup. From the vague orange hue of the street lamp outside, I could make out the unmoving silhouette of the autumn trees. I noticed not a drop of water had painted the glass of the window, as a dried leaf fluttered to the ground, ominously, threatening me. I was only shaken from my trance-like gaze by the sensation of icy water overflowing onto my hand from the now full cup I was holding. I poured a little out and placed it on the counter. I couldn't bear the silence. It was almost agonizing. I pulled my phone from my pocket and began to play my music again, louder this time. Leaning on the counter, I drank from my glass, but as I did, through the blare of my earphones, I heard a sound. At least, I thought I did. It sounded like 3 knocks, all in very quick succession like a woodpecker's beak. I yanked out my earphones, almost dropping my water as I spun to face the front door. I scowled at it, questioning whether I had heard anything at all. My question was quickly answered as the 3 distinct knocks rang out again. Placing my water down, I wandered to the door. Plucking the bowl of candy off the ground, I opened the door. I mean, after all, trick-or-treaters are uncommon around here, but not unheard of. But as the door creaked towards me, I was left facing an empty doorway before a dark and vacant street. Puzzled and slightly peeved, I glared out into the night. A thin mist crawled along the gravel and the concrete as a pallid moon loomed in its fullness over it. But no person could be seen running from my house. I scoffed, admittedly a little impressed. Whichever kid was ding-dong ditching me was very fast. I turned, slamming the door behind me, but before I could make it 2 steps back into my house, I jumped a little as I heard a sound I half expected. The same 3 distinct knocks behind me. Annoyed and startled, I turned back facing the door, as fast as my body would allow, and subsequently flung it open again, revealing the black street in its hollowed evening glory. But this time, it was not so empty. Before me, not more than half a foot from the door, was what I figured to be a young boy. Based on his height, he couldn't have been more than 8 years old, a lone trick-or-treater. He was draped in a messy black cloth which fell below his feet. A hood drooped just past the top of a plastic skull mask. 2 beady brown eyes ogled at me from behind it. A young Grim Reaper, the boy surely was. His costume was a little tacky, but admittedly, not awful. In one hand, the boy clutched the character's signature scythe, and in the other, a large, orange, pumpkin-shaped bucket which he held out towards me. I stood there for a moment, just waiting for the boy to utter that iconic phrase, "trick or treat," which was supposed to mark the start of the transaction, but he never did. Instead, he stood there, silently, just as I was. Before it started to get awkward, he gestured down to the bucket with his masked head, which he had extended towards me, and shook it. I looked down to it. The pumpkin was noticeably empty, so, feeling bad, I took out an extra large handful of candy from our goodie bowl and dropped them into his bucket. But something peculiar happened as I did. The boy growled at me. Actually growled at me. Like he couldn't use language to communicate. The sound slowly dribbled out from behind his skeletal mask, like a low rumble. There was something quite funny about it, to be honest. I tilted my head in confusion. "What?" I shrugged. Then he did it again, but it was more of an animalistic snarl this time, before he furiously shook his bucket. "Do you not like that type of candy? I can go and look around." I was suddenly cut short as the boy whined begrudgingly, flipping his bucket upside down, its contents spilling out onto the floor. "Hey, what did you do that for?" I practically shouted. In response, the boy, almost comically, started moaning and stomping his feet on the ground. I poked my head out the doorway over the boy and looked both ways down the lane for the kid's guardian. Nothing. Still just a hollow street under pale moonlight. I turned my attention back to the boy having his little tantrum. "Listen, if you try some of these other houses, they might have what you want," I said lightly, pointing to the rest of the houses on the street. But his moaning continued. Now, under normal circumstances, I would have never done what I did, but something about that monotonous whine just enraged me, so, out of spite, I shut the door on the boy, leaving him to go bother some other poor sod. Almost magically, as the door clicked shut, the awful sound immediately ended. As if as soon as he was out of sight, he stopped existing. I breathed a sigh of relief before slumping in front of the TV, flicking to whichever channel looked interesting. Sinking into the couch, lying horizontally, I began to feel a tad less lucid, fading in and out of sleep, much like earlier. But before I could slip away, I was jolted upright by a sound. 3 rapid knocks on the door. I rubbed my eyes and scowled. It couldn't be. I pushed myself onto my feet and headed for the door. Hesitantly, I glared through the peephole and let out an exhausted sigh when I saw the very top of a black hood thinly covering white plastic. With reluctance, I opened the door. "Listen, kid, I don't know what—" I started to say, but before I could finish, the young Reaper barged past me into my home, the top of his plastic scythe brushing past my arm. Stunned, I turned to see what the hell he was doing. To my near astonishment, the little shit skipped through my house to the kitchen and plopped himself down on one of the wooden stools beside the counter. Being of short stature, the masked youngster's legs dangled downwards just above the tiles on the floor. I moved to the kitchen after him. "Hey, what are you doing, kid? You can't just run into someone's house like that." I reasoned as the boy placed a still empty pumpkin bucket on the counter. I stood on the opposite side of the counter, my palms on its surface while the boy blissfully looked to its surroundings, like he'd never been inside a house before. "Hey, are you lost? Do you need help, kid?" I asked, snapping my fingers to get his attention. The shiny eyes behind his mask focused on me for a moment, as if he was about to say something, but he remained silent. "Can you at least tell me your name?" I queried with a softness in my voice. I didn't let it show, but I was basically begging the boy to say something, anything. Still, the boy was speechless. I sighed comically loud, letting my head go limp. The boy's gaze wandered again. "Okay," I said, frustrated. "I'll tell you what. We're gonna go through every goodie in the house until we find something you like, okay?" The child barely reacted to my proposition. Once again, I snapped my fingers condescendingly. That seemed to get his attention. "Once you have what you want, will you leave me alone?" To my sheer astonishment, the boy nodded. Finally, we had gotten somewhere. I mean, it wasn't language, but beggars can't be choosers, can we? And with that, I stomped to the front door to retrieve the treat bowl. I dumped its contents onto the counter before the boy where he still sat, wagging his legs back and forth like an excited dog. I dove into the drawers behind the boy for anything spare. An old bag of Haribos, a couple bars of chocolate, and some popsicles all went into my assortment of potential treats. "Okay, let's see what we have here," I said playfully, hiding my inner exasperation as I rummaged through the pile. "Oh, this looks nice." I pulled out a lollipop at random. I twirled it in front of the kid's face. With hither to no hesitation, the boy shook his head disapprovingly. I huffed and slid the lollipop to the other end of the counter, and one by one we went through the pile. Each time, no matter how well I sold it, the young reaper would shake his head, and I would slide whatever it was to be with the rest of the rejected sweets which, before long, began to become a pile of their own. I was alarmed when the boy turned down the unopened bag of Haribos. I noticed my dwindling number of treats which I was yet to try. This wasn't working. Defeated, I combed my fingers through my hair and sat opposite the boy. I looked at him intently, trying and failing to figure him out. But as I ogled at the boy, draped in black and face obscured, one question continued to itch at my brain. "Kid, if you don't like any of the candy, why are you out trick-or-treating? I mean, what are you after? Because, and I'll be honest with you, you're not going to find much else in these other houses." The boy tilted his head slightly. "Alright, well, let's get through the rest of these," I said, getting to my feet. "There still might be something you like in here." But as I went to grab another treat from the pile, I was startled backwards. The boy let out a piercing, bloody shriek from behind his mask before he violently pushed the pile onto the floor. The candy sprawled out over the tiles around my feet. He continued to scream and cry as he clutched his orange bucket, slamming it over and over again on the counter. "What was that for?" I yelled over the boy's relentless howls. "Okay, I was willing to entertain this, but I'm done now." I reached for my phone. "I'm calling my parents, and if they tell me to grab you by the neck and throw your ass onto the street, I will." I would have done it right away, but I'd be wrong to say I wouldn't have felt awful if I were to lay my hands on the kid, even if he was being a brat. The boy fell silent once again as I scrolled through my phone, finding Mom among my contacts. As it rang, I put it to speaker in case the boy started up again, though I doubted they wouldn't be able to hear his cries anyway. The phone buzzed, and after a moment, my call was answered. But before I could get a word out, an unfamiliar voice spoke to me.
"Hello? Who's this?"
A gruff, stern voice asked me. I checked to see if I had called the wrong number. Mom, it still read at the top. This was most certainly the right number.
"Okay, I understand you're Mr. and Mrs. Matthews' son."
The voice sung. "Yeah, who the hell are you?" I stuttered, nervous and more than tense.
"Well, my name is Officer Willard, and, son, I regret to tell you this, but your mom and pops have been involved in an unfortunate drunken roadside collision."
The man said. And just as he did, distant screams and wails began to build up on the other end of the phone. That voice I did recognize. My mother.
Let me speak to him. Let me speak to my boy.
I made out over other distant sirens and chatter. I was near speechless. My chest tightened and my throat thinned as if being constricted.
Now your folks are fine, if not a bit shaken. They will be spending some time with us down at the station, and your father will almost definitely be taken to court, but physically, they're unharmed.
So, what happened? I managed to squeak out.
Well, about 30 minutes ago, your father's vehicle collided with a boy who was crossing the road. The boy, who we have now learned is an 8-year-old named Harlan, was killed on impact.
The officer explained to me, as softly as he could. Jesus. I whimpered. There were tears in my eyes. 8 years old? I muttered, nearly choking.
I'm sorry, son.
The officer said sympathetically. Even he sounded sad.
Well, as your father has explained to us, young Harlan here was crossing the road, but because of his dark costume, he went unnoticed.
I pulled my head up. What did you just say?
Yeah, the boy's dark costume was hard to see. He appears to be dressed as the Grim Reaper.
I turned to the child, still sat across from me, blissfully wagging his legs. Without even hanging up, I put the phone down on the counter.
You still there, son?
The officer continued.
Now I know you must be worried, but...
His words faded into the background as I looked into those empty brown eyes. Hollow and icy as a glacier they were. His ghostly visage sat there, knowingly staring at me from beyond that pale mask. With his small, gentle hands, he picked up his bucket again, shaking it at me. It was still empty. I understood then. It wasn't candy he wanted. It never was. He was the harvester of souls, after all.